You always are nervous when you put all the work into building a wall, and in the same way, you won't believe what just happened in the deep wilderness of Alaska. 1 minute ago, shocking news broke about Marty Meierotto, one of the well-known mountain men. Someone finally dared to go up and check Marty Meierotto's old trapline hut. And what they found inside has left everyone completely shaken, unable to piece together how things went so wrong. Before we dive into the details of what really happened, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on your notifications, because we're about to uncover what a mountain man had been hiding all these years. As the story about Marty spreads, one question rises above everything else. What really happened out there? Watch this video to the end, because what's about to be revealed will leave you speechless. Marty Meierotto spends every winter living in a primitive one-room log cabin deep in the interior of Alaska, located hundreds of miles from civilization. At first, no one thought much of it. Marty was known for disappearing into the wild for weeks, sometimes months. He was built for the cold, for the silence, for the kind of life that most people couldn't handle for even a day. 3 of them. Yeah, the neighbors weren't kind to. He's the man we've been watching on Mountain Men as he maneuvers brutal winters and faces the dangers of the wild. But this time, it is different. He is not in the news because of the weather or the wilderness. It is because of something far more sinister, something cold, something that has left the whole Mountain Men community in shock. It is about what they discovered when they opened the door to his old trapline hut. It all started when neighbors noticed that Marty hadn't been seen for days after he checked into his cabin, as he does every winter. He hadn't been seen on the trails, and even his close friend in Alaska, who usually heard from him by now, had nothing. But then, a strange smoke had been noticed coming up from the hut. It didn't look like it came from a cabin or a wood stove. That's why it was pretty suspicious. No one expected what came next, though. 2 trappers decided to visit the trapline cabin and check on Marty. It wasn't unusual for trappers to look out for one another, especially when the cold got harsh and the nights stretched endlessly. They packed light and set out toward the cabin. The air in Alaska that morning was very chilly, the kind of cold that makes the snow crunch louder beneath your boots. For miles, all they could hear was the wind brushing through the pines and the faint groan of the frozen ground beneath them. They didn't talk much. Both were thinking about what could have possibly kept Marty out for that long. When they finally reached the valley where his hut stood, the snow was higher than usual. The small wooden hut that Marty had built with his own hands sat at the edge of a clearing, half covered by snow. The roof sagged slightly under the weight, but it remained firm, just like the man who had built it. The 2 men stopped about 50 feet away. Something didn't feel right. No tracks led to or from the cabin, and there were no signs of recent movement, just silence. An eerie feeling filled the air, the kind that makes your stomach tighten. They called out to Marty, but there was no response. They waited and called his name again. Still, they got no response. They moved closer. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, likely pushed open by the wind. That was strange. Marty never left his door open, not even when he was nearby. One of the men moved closer, brushing snow off his gloves as he reached for the handle. The other stayed back, watching. The door creaked as it swung open when the man pushed it. Inside, the air was still cold and heavy. He stood by the door and called out to Marty quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Still, there was no answer. The men then stepped slowly into the small room. It was dim, lit only by the pale light sneaking in through the cracks in the walls. Something felt off. Everything in the room was scattered. The table, the stove, and his gear were neatly overturned. His coat wasn't there, and his rifle was missing, too. It looked like someone had left the room in a hurry, like the person was trying to hide something. The 2 men exchanged a glance. They'd known Marty long enough to recognize that he was a man who loves orderliness. He didn't make careless mistakes, and he never left his space untidy for any reason. So, could he have intentionally done this? That's what was on the mind of the men as they padded around. One of the men walked over to the stove. It was cold, with ash inside looking like it had been there for days or maybe even weeks. He looked at the mug beside it, and it was half full of frozen water, a small detail, but enough to tell him something wasn't right. All of this looked too suspicious, as if everything was staged. But what was Marty trying to hide? Did he involve himself in something sinister? One of the men walked toward the back of the cabin. Then he suddenly froze. There was something on the floor. "Don't come over here," he finally said quietly with a shaky voice. But it was too late. His friend had already seen it. Whatever it was left both men speechless. One of them took several steps back, and the other just stood still, frozen not from the cold, but from something dreadful. They stayed there for a few minutes, just staring, minutes, maybe longer. Neither spoke a word. Then, without saying anything more, they backed out of the cabin and pulled the door shut behind them. The snow began to fall harder, covering their tracks as they left. They didn't look back. When they finally made it back, they radioed the base camp and dropped a simple message. "We just found something dreadful in Marty Meierotto's Trapline hut." That was all they said. Later that night, word about the trip began to spread quickly in the Alaska community. People were asking questions, wondering what could be in that hut that would shake two men like that. These were people who had seen accidents, storms, predators, but their reaction this time was different. By morning, a small search group was prepared to go back. But before they left, the two original men refused to return. One said he'd seen enough of that place to last him a lifetime, and the other wouldn't even explain what he meant. The wilderness doesn't give up its secrets easily, and that day, it seemed like Marty's cabin had become one of them. For the rest of that week, the weather turned worse. Heavy snow buried the trails and the hut disappeared beneath it. But the story continued to spread like a whisper across the towns. What did they see? What could make grown men who lived through blizzards and bear attacks become this disheveled? We would find out the answer to that. The only thing sure is that they had found something in that cabin. Something that made them realize Marty was not who everyone thought he was. No one knew what. And the two men who discovered it weren't talking. And as the snow kept falling, the question began to grow louder than the storm itself. What did they really find inside Marty Meierotto's Trapline hut? The small search party was ready to leave by noon. The team consisted of 3 locals who were familiar with the terrain and a wildlife officer who had previously worked with Marty. They had packed early on, carrying only what they needed: ropes, flashlights, and water. Nobody said it out loud, but they were all wondering the same thing. If whatever was found in the cabin made the 2 tough trappers come back looking pale and speechless, what was awaiting them? The sky was clear when they started their snowmobiles, but the air was cold and freezing. Every sound echoed across the clearing. When they reached the edge, everything looked just as the men had described. The hut stood silent and alone, half buried in snow, the wind sweeping across the roof as if trying to erase the place from memory. One of the men turned off his engine and just stared for a moment. "You feel that?" he asked. The others didn't answer, but they all felt that strange, heavy silence that hangs in the air when something isn't right. They stepped off the machines and approached the door slowly, their boots sinking deep into the snow with every step. When they finally reached the porch, one of the men brushed the snow from the handle and pushed the door open. Immediately, that same creak echoed through the air again, the exact same sound that had stopped the first 2 men in their tracks earlier. Inside the small cabin, everything was dark and still, and the cold air was sharp enough to sting your throat with every breath. A thin layer of frost coated the table and even the wooden walls, sparkling faintly under the sweeping glow of their flashlights. Everything inside remained exactly where Marty had left it, down to the smallest item. His gearbox sat wide open, his tools scattered across the ground as if dropped mid-task. The chair was still overturned together with the table, his jacket lay discarded on the floor, and his rifle was still missing. The whole scene felt frozen in time, as though the world had simply stopped moving the moment Marty walked out. One of the men called out softly, "Marty," but even that gentle voice sounded unusually loud in the cramped space. No answer came. They spread out carefully, each man moving slowly, their footsteps almost silent against the icy floor. The wildlife officer checked the stove and noticed the ashes inside were cold and gray, but not ancient. Someone had burned a fire in the cabin recently, perhaps just a few days or maybe a week ago. One of the men whispered that if that was true, then Marty must have been here in the cabin, and he was the one who lit it. Another man picked up a notebook left behind the door. He flipped through a few pages, studying the rough handwriting inside. The notes talked about the weather, the number of traps Marty had set, and even contained quick sketches of the surrounding terrain. The man frowned as he read, staring at the pages far longer than expected. "Something's not right," he murmured quietly. The others didn't respond. Instead, they noticed something else, faint marks on the wooden floor near the back wall. They weren't footprints or scratches from tools. They looked more like something had been dragged lightly across the floor, then suddenly stopped. The wildlife officer knelt down to get a better look, brushing snow away from the boards. For a split second, his flashlight reflected off something shiny before he abruptly turned it off. He rose to his feet slowly. "What did you see?" one of the men asked. The officer didn't answer. He only scanned the cabin once more, his expression tightening with unease. Then he told the team they had to leave. And so they did. None of them said a word until they were several feet away from the hut, walking through lightly falling snow that covered their boots and erased their trail behind them. Finally, one of the men broke the silence and asked what the officer had seen. The officer only shook his head and said it wasn't something he could explain, not yet. They remained outside for a long time, staring back at the hut. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward the door as if expecting someone, or something, to come out. But nothing moved. By the time they headed back, daylight was fading. The valley darkened, and the sky turned orange above the ridges. Everything felt colder and quieter. Even the sound of their snowmobiles seemed muted, swallowed up by the dense trees. When they finally reached the small town that night, they gave a brief report describing how the room looked disorganized, though they either provided too many unnecessary details or failed to explain what they had truly seen. The officer said they would return when the weather cleared, but his voice sounded tired and uncertain. The trappers who had gone before them asked very few questions. They didn't want to. Deep down, they already knew that whatever was inside that hut was not something easily described. In the days that followed, people tried to piece together what had happened. Some insisted the hut had been empty. Others claimed there were signs Marty had left behind something mysterious. A few even whispered about a note he might have written, hinting at what he'd been feeling in his last days on the Trapline, though no one ever actually saw it. The story began to grow in hushed tones, and each version sounded slightly different. But the feeling behind all of them was always the same: unease, sadness, confusion. No one brought forward pictures or leaked details. It was as if everyone who had gone there silently agreed not to talk about what they found. One of the locals who helped organize the search said something that stuck in people's minds. "There are things you see out there that you just have to keep to yourself." That single line spread faster than any official report, and strangely enough, it made the whole situation feel even worse. The cabin remained buried under snow, holding whatever truth was left inside. For the first time, people realized that maybe it wasn't about what they found. It was about what they felt when they saw it. That heavy silence, that eerie moment when even the wind seemed to stop. What could cause such a reaction? What could make grown men who had hunted wolves, survived storms, and fought against the wilderness, stand frozen, unable to speak? No one could say. As night settled over the valley again, the hut faded into darkness. The snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering every track of those who had come and gone. And yet whatever they found, whatever left them speechless, stayed right where it had always been. By the time the word reached the small Alaskan town, people were already whispering about Marty's Trapline hut. Nobody knew the whole story, but everyone agreed something wasn't right. The few who had traveled up the trail and returned didn't say much, just that it was dreadful. That alone was enough to keep most people away. That old hut had stood for years, a place where Marty tested his limits against the brutal cold and proved that man and nature could still coexist. But now it felt like a home of secrets, a place that raised questions instead of admiration. The first search team hadn't expected to find much. They thought maybe the cabin had been torn apart by animals or collapsed under snow. But when they stepped inside, it wasn't the mess or damage that unsettled them. It was the mystery waiting quietly in the shadows. One member of the search team later told someone at the general store that he couldn't stay in the hut more than a couple of minutes. He said the air felt wrong, as if the place was holding on to something it shouldn't. He didn't say what he saw, but his pale face told the rest. No one expected the hut to be in such a condition. Months had passed since anyone had visited, yet some things looked untouched, while other parts appeared recently disturbed. The wood stove was clean, the lantern still held oil, and the table in the center, where Marty always wrote his notes, had deep marks carved across it, like something had been dragged there in a hurry. The men didn't stay long. They left quickly, said nothing, and returned straight to town. A few days later, a man who had worked with Marty before went up to the hut to see it for himself. When he came back, he looked pale and simply said, "It's not what you think," refusing to ever return again. That moment changed everything. Rumors began to spread. Some said Marty left something behind and didn't want anyone to find it. Others believed something in that hut wasn't his doing at all. Someone else had been there, someone who knew the place as well as Marty did. But the most chilling rumor came from a pilot who flew over the area one morning. He claimed he saw smoke rising from the hut, as if someone was inside. Yet when he landed and checked it out later that day, the hut was completely cold. No fire, No footprints, no sign of life, just that same eerie quiet that wrapped around the valley like a warning. Those who knew Marty couldn't make sense of it. He wasn't the type of man to leave things untidy. Every part of his life was built on routine. He wakes up every day, checks his traps, fixes his gear, and goes out hunting. He didn't miss a step, so for him to leave a place half-used, half-abandoned made no sense. A few of his close friends went back through his journals trying to piece things together. In one of the last entries, Marty wrote something that made people uneasy. It said, "I had to do it. I had no other option." That was it. No follow-up, no explanation, nothing after that page. It's a strange thing to think that a man like Marty, who so many admired, would go as far as committing such a heinous crime. He was never afraid of the wild. So, if he did something this scary, then what else had he been hiding all these years? Weeks went by and still no one wanted to go near that hut. Even snowmobilers avoided that trail. It became a kind of boundary, a place people talked about but didn't approach. There was a feeling that everyone should be far away from whatever was inside. Then came the rumor. Someone claimed that late one night they saw a faint light from the direction of the hut. Just a flicker, a few seconds, then darkness again. People laughed it off at first. But when a second person said the same thing, the laughter stopped. The light had been seen twice, days apart, both times in the dead of night. Some thought Marty had come back to cover his tracks, maybe he didn't want to be found, while others believed it was someone else keeping watch. But those who knew the woods best said there's no way anyone could stay up there that long without supplies. The cold would eat you alive. Still, that light made people wonder what exactly was in that hut. And the story continued to spread. The locals stopped talking about what they found and started talking about what's still there. By now, the small town had turned quiet about Marty. Even those who used to brag about knowing him kept their distance from the topic. There's something about not knowing that keeps people uneasy. You want answers, but you also don't want to know them. That's what his hut had become. Someone once said, if you stay quiet long enough in the wild, you'll do something you've never done. Maybe Marty had done something he shouldn't have. Perhaps that's why his last note sounded more like a confession. The snow kept falling, covering the path to his hut, hiding every sign of who might have gone in or out. Nature had taken over again, almost as if it wanted to bury the story along with the cabin. But people can't forget. Someone always brings up the story about the hut and what was found inside every winter. Even now, no one can say for sure what it was. Whatever they saw, whatever they felt, it changed them. You can see it in their eyes when they talk about it. And maybe that's why so few people go near that place anymore. The truth is, Marty's Trapline hut still stands somewhere deep in that frozen valley of Alaska. The snow covers its roof. The cold bites at its walls, and yet somehow it feels alive. And the question remains, what did they really find in there? Is Marty really capable of committing such a crime? When winter finally loosened its grip and the first signs of spring crept across Alaska, a small team decided to go back to Marty Meierotto's Trapline hut. The story had grown too big to ignore. Locals wanted answers. And even though most were too afraid to go, 3 men volunteered to check it out. It was a ranger, a longtime trapper, and a man who once called Marty a friend. They didn't go for excitement or fame. They went because they wanted peace of mind. Too many rumors were spreading through town and people were starting to imagine things that might not be true. But deep down, each man also carried quiet curiosity. What could have possibly shaken so many people before them? The journey wasn't easy. Even with the snow melting, the trail to Marty's hut was still half buried in ice, and they had to clear out a path in the snow to get to it. The sun had already begun to rise when they finally reached the area where Marty's cabin was located. From a distance, the cabin was hidden behind the trees, but as they got closer, they saw its roof among the trees. The hut looked smaller than they expected. The ranger went in first, pushing the door open with his gloved hand. It creaked, but not like a standard old door. It was long and uneven, almost like the sound was stretching itself through the air. Inside, the light was thin. Dust floated in the air, catching the last orange glow from outside. Everything looked almost the same as before. The boots by the door, the old stove, and the pile of wood were all scattered. They also noticed the marks on the table and the wall, but there were a few new things they couldn't explain. A piece of rope hung from one of the beams, and it appeared to have been recently tied. None of them spoke for a while. It was the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess your own heartbeat. The man who knew Marty best finally whispered, "This isn't how he left it." His voice cracked a little when he said it. They moved slowly, checking each corner. The ranger opened a small wooden box on the shelf, expecting to find traps or maps, but he saw nothing. One of the men stepped outside for a breath of air. He said later that the silence out there felt worse than the one inside. The trees around the hut were still, not even a breeze, but he swore he heard a faint crack from deeper in the woods, like a branch breaking under weight. When he looked, there was nothing there. Back inside, the others found more small details that didn't fit. Marty's coat, the one he always wore, was lying on the floor by the window. It looked clean, too clean, like someone had just thrown it off in a hurry. His traps were also scattered in one corner of the room, and the firewood was half burnt, as if someone had made a fire recently. They found no footprints outside, no sign of movement, no food, and no strange tools. It was like the place was preparing itself for someone's return. As night fell, they set up a small lantern. None of them wanted to admit it, but the air inside the hut began to feel heavier. The light flickered, not from wind, but from something unseen. The man closest to the wall said he felt like the shadows were moving. It was not obvious, just enough to make your skin tighten. They agreed to stay a little longer to make notes and take pictures, but the longer they stayed, the harder it was to focus. The ranger kept glancing at the door. The man who had known Marty kept staring at the table, tracing the carved lines with his finger. He said they weren't random marks, that they looked as if someone had scratched them in a struggle, but he couldn't make out any scene that could have led to it. The sun had already gone down when they decided to leave. They packed up quietly and stepped outside. The moment they crossed the clearing, one of them turned back. The heaviness and coldness that had settled in his heart after visiting that hut lingered on. Back in town, the men didn't say much. They filed a brief report with the ranger's office stating that they found no signs of life despite some evidence of foul play. However, they all agreed that something about that place wasn't right and there was a secret buried in it. The word spread again and the story grew. Some said the men saw something they refused to talk about. Others believed Marty's hut was still active and that it somehow held on to the life that once filled it. A local pilot decided to fly over a few days later. He said from above the area looked completely quiet with no sign of life. But when he circled once more, he caught a faint smoke near the roof, like metal reflecting sunlight. He turned his plane, but when he came around again, it was gone. By now, people had stopped treating it as just another story. The hut had become a haunted ground. Some people even said it was a sign Marty had never really left and that he might be the one coming around to commit the crime. The ranger, who had gone on that trip, eventually left town. He said it wasn't because of the hut, but everyone knew better. He had changed. He now spoke less, stayed indoors, and avoided the woods. The other two men rarely came to town at all. Since then, no one's been brave enough to go back. The trail is still there, but most of it's buried in snow and branches now. Nature has almost completely hidden the way. Yet now and then when someone mentions Marty's name, the conversation constantly circles back to that hut. People still ask the same question. They are all wondering what was found that day in the hut. What could make grown men turn pale and stay silent? No one has an answer. And maybe that's the real reason no one dares to find out again. Whatever they found inside that Trapline hut still haunts everyone who hears this story. Whatever happened in that hut, whatever was seen or felt inside those wooden walls only points to a crime scene. People are still waiting for the day the truth will be revealed and every secret buried in that cabin will be uncovered.